There is no more honest place in the world than the room where a child is born. I have spent 22 years in that room, in every variation it takes across the houses of Chatham County, Georgia, from the grand bedrooms of the planter families on the squares of Savannah, to the cramped dark spaces in the quarters where enslaved women labored without the linen sheets and the imported basins and the whiskey for the pain that the main house bedrooms provided. And I can tell you that the honesty of the birthing room is not gentle, and it is not comfortable, and it is not the kind of honesty that the people who enter it as participants, rather than observers, are always grateful for afterward. The birthing room strips everything away. It strips away the social performance and the careful management of appearance and the specific fictions that families maintain about themselves and about each other, and about the world they have constructed around their wealth and their names and their position in the hierarchies of Savannah society. It strips all of it away and leaves what is actually there, which is a woman in extremity, and the people who love her, or need her, or own her, or are simply present because the situation requires their presence, all of them reduced to what they actually are, rather than what they have been performing. I have seen what people actually are in the birthing room. I have seen it 147 times across 22 years of practice, in the bedrooms of the Caldwell family, and the Mercer family, and the Whitmore family, and the Beaumont family, and the Gordon family, and in the quarters and the cabins and the small rooms of Savannah's free black community, and wherever else a woman was laboring, and someone had thought to send for me. I know what I know because I have been in that room every time it mattered for 22 years. And what I know is the subject of this account, not because I want you to understand what a midwife knows, though I do, but because what I know is what I used in the spring of 1859 to protect my daughter from the specific fate that the most powerful man in Chatham County had decided she was going to experience, and the using of it is the story. My name is Pearl. I am 61 years old. I was born enslaved in Savannah, Georgia in the year 1802, the daughter of a woman named Grace, who was herself a midwife, who learned the work from the woman before her in the way that such knowledge has always passed, through the direct transmission of one woman's accumulated understanding to the next woman willing to receive it completely and to carry it forward with the same seriousness with which it was given. My mother taught me everything she knew, the anatomy of birth and its complications and the specific interventions that the complications require, the plants and their preparations, and which ones ease pain and which ones slow bleeding, and which ones do the other things that the birthing room sometimes requires. The management of fear, which is its own discipline, the specific quality of calm authority that the room needs from the midwife when the woman in the bed is most afraid, the calm that is not the absence of knowing how serious the situation is, but the decision to carry the seriousness without showing it in any way that increases the fear it is responding to. She taught me the reading of situations, which is the most important skill the work requires, and the one that cannot be taught through any method other than the direct transmission of accumulated experience. The reading of a labor's progress that allows the midwife to understand at each moment what the situation is and what it is moving toward, and what the available responses to it are, and which response the specific situation requires. This reading is not mystical. It is the product of pattern recognition built through years of observation, the accumulated comparison of 147 situations against each other that produces, in the person who has made those comparisons, the specific ability to understand a new situation by reference to the accumulated understanding of all the previous ones. I could read every situation I was placed in. I had been able to do this since before I fully understood what the reading was, since the years of working alongside my mother, when the reading was happening in her, and I was observing it and absorbing it without yet having the direct experience that would make it mine, rather than simply something I had witnessed. By the time I was practicing alone, which began when my mother died in 1837, when I was 35 years old, and had been her assistant for 17 years, I had the reading completely. I had it in the specific way that the most important knowledge is held, not as a set of remembered rules, but as a living understanding, a capacity that operated in the birthing room the way expert judgment operates in any domain where the expertise has been sufficiently developed, which is automatically and immediately and with the specific confidence that comes from understanding a situation more completely than anyone else present. I was called to every significant birth in Chatham County, not just the enslaved community's births, though those were the foundation of my practice and the births I was most consistently present for. The white planter families called for me because my reputation, built through 22 years of consistent results, had made me the first choice in any birth that was difficult or anticipated to be difficult. And difficult births among the wealthiest families in Savannah were not births that any of those families was willing to manage without the best available practitioner, regardless of what that practitioner's legal status was. This was the specific form of my value and the specific form of my access. The Caldwell family, the Mercer family, the Whitmore family, the Beaumont family, the Gordon family, every one of them had called for me at the birth of at least one child, and some of them had called for me at the birth of every child, and I had been in their bedrooms and their birthing rooms, and I had been present in those rooms during the hours when the fictions those families maintained about themselves were most completely stripped away, and I had seen what was underneath. I had kept everything I saw, not as a threat, not as a collection of information I was building for any specific purpose, as the knowledge of a practitioner who understood that the information gathered in the birthing room was gathered in a specific condition of trust that the families extended to me because the extension of it was necessary, because the birthing room's work required it, and that this trust was both the foundation of my practice and the most significant element of the access it gave me. I had never violated the trust. 22 years. Not once. In the spring of 1859, I found the first situation that was sufficient to change that. My daughter Seraphine was born in 1840, which made her 19 years old in the spring of 1859, the year this account is concerned with. She was born in the room adjacent to the one where I slept, in the small house on the edge of the Caldwell property, where I had been living since 1837, the house that had been provided to me as part of the arrangement under which I practiced, an arrangement that gave me more independence than most enslaved people in Savannah possessed, and less than any free person required, and that I had maintained for 22 years with the specific, careful balance of someone who understood that the arrangement was valuable and that its value depended on its continued functioning. Seraphine's father was a free black man named Thomas, who worked at the docks and who had been part of my life for 3 years before his death in 1843, 3 years after Seraphine was born, of the fever that took people in Savannah with the specific democratic indifference of diseases that do not consult social hierarchies before selecting their victims. He died when Seraphine was 3 years old, and I raised her alone in the way that I did everything, which was with complete attention and the specific kind of practical love that does not confuse tenderness with softness and does not mistake the absence of difficulty for the presence of safety. I raised her to understand what the world around her was and what it required of a person in her situation, not to frighten her, but to prepare her, because preparation and fear are different things, and the difference matters enormously in how a person navigates a situation that requires navigation. I gave her the preparation that my mother had given me, as complete and as honest as I could make it, and I gave her, in addition to the preparation, whatever I could give her from the specific resources my own position provided, which were more resources than most enslaved women in Savannah had access to, but less than the situation required for anything approaching genuine safety. She was, by 19, her father's daughter, in the ways that mattered most, with his specific quality of presence, the quality of a person who occupies the space they are in completely, without needing to announce the occupation. And my mother's eyes, which were the eyes that I had inherited, and that I watched skip my generation and land in Seraphine's face with the specific satisfaction that the skipping of generations sometimes produces when what is skipped reappears. She was also beautiful. I say this not with pride, but with the specific awareness that her beauty was, in the world she lived in, and the specific context of the Caldwell plantation in 1859, a liability rather than an asset, the kind of quality that drew the kind of attention that the drawing of was dangerous, in the way that all attention from certain directions is dangerous in that context. Master Randolph Caldwell's son, whose name was Edmund, and who was 26 years old in the spring of 1859, had noticed Seraphine. I do not need to describe the specific sequence of events that led from Edmund Caldwell, noticing Seraphine, to Master Randolph Caldwell, summoning me to the main house in April of 1859 to inform me that Seraphine had been selected to serve as Edmund's personal attendant, because the sequence is the sequence that everyone in Savannah who paid attention to the way the Caldwell household operated had seen operate before and understood completely, and the understanding of it was the understanding of what had happened to the 3 women before Seraphine, who had been selected for similar positions, and what those selections had produced for those women, and what had become of them after the producing. I went to the main house when summoned. I stood across the desk from Randolph Caldwell, who was 62 years old and the patriarch of the most powerful family in Chatham County, and who sat across that desk from me with the specific casual authority of a man who has never in his life had a decision he made questioned by the person the decision was about. And I received what he told me with the composed professional face I had been bringing to every interaction with every member of every family I served for 22 years. I said nothing during the conversation that was not the expected response to what was said to me. I said yes, sir, when yes, sir was expected, and I said I understand when I understand was expected, and I said thank you, sir, when the conversation ended, and he expected the thanking. Then I left the main house, and I walked back to my small house on the edge of the property, and I sat in the chair by the window, and I thought about what I was going to do. I want to explain what 22 years of practice as the midwife for the 5 wealthiest families in Chatham County had given me, not in the medical dimension, which I have already described, but in the dimension of knowledge about the families themselves, because that knowledge was the resource I was going to use, and the understanding of what it contained is essential to the understanding of how I used it. The Caldwell family first, because the Caldwell family was the situation. Randolph Caldwell had built the largest plantation operation in Chatham County through 30 years of the specific accumulation that tobacco and cotton and the labor of enslaved people produces for men who are willing to manage all 3 with the relentless efficiency that Randolph brought to everything. He was 62 and healthy and showed no signs of imminent incapacity, but 62 was 62, and the question of the inheritance had been present in the Caldwell family's calculations for at least a decade, visible to anyone who paid attention to the conversations that happened in rooms where I was present, and that continued to happen as if I were not present, because I had spent 22 years being present in a way that did not register. Edmund was the eldest son and the heir apparent. He was also, as anyone who had observed him closely could confirm, a man whose capabilities were not the capabilities that the inheritance required, not in the catastrophic sense of Robert Grayson, but in the more common sense of a man who has been formed entirely by the expectation of inheriting power, rather than by the experience of building it, who lacks the specific judgment that building produces, and who has substituted for that judgment a confidence that is not grounded in evidence. Randolph knew this. He knew it in the way that intelligent fathers know things about their children that they do not say directly, a knowledge that shows in the specific quality of attention he brought to Edmund's management decisions, and in the specific quality of the corrections he made, quietly and without public acknowledgement, to the mistakes that Edmund made regularly enough that the corrections had become a structural feature of the plantation's management rather than a response to occasional error. The inheritance was not settled in the way that inheritances appear settled from the outside. Randolph had a second son, Charles, who was 23, and who was in many ways what Edmund was not, sharper, more attentive, with the specific quality of judgment that comes from watching an older sibling make mistakes and quietly noting what the mistakes were and why they were mistakes, and what would have been done differently by someone who was actually attending to the situation rather than performing confidence at it. The inheritance question and its specific dynamics was something I had been observing for years in the conversations that happened in rooms where I was present and that continued to happen as if I were not. I knew that the question was more open than it appeared from outside the family. I knew that Randolph's assessment of Edmund had been declining for at least 2 years and his assessment of Charles rising. And I knew, most importantly, the specific thing that would make the question more open than it currently was, the specific development that would force Randolph to address directly what he had been managing indirectly for years. That development was the birth that was coming. Edmund's wife, Louisa, was pregnant with her first child in the spring of 1859. The pregnancy was advanced, the birth expected in June, and the birth of Edmund's heir was the specific event that would either consolidate his position in the inheritance, or if the birth produced a complication that I was uniquely positioned to understand and to address, produce a development that changed the calculation. I am going to be precise about what I mean by this, because precision is what the account requires. Louisa Caldwell was 22 years old and in her first pregnancy, and the pregnancy had been, in the months I had been monitoring it as part of my general care for the Caldwell household's medical needs, presenting specific indicators that the birth was likely to be difficult. Not impossible, not certainly dangerous. Difficult in the specific ways that first pregnancies in young women with certain anatomical characteristics are sometimes difficult, ways that I understood completely and that I had managed many times across 22 years of practice with varying outcomes, depending on the specific decisions made in the critical moments of the labor. I was going to be in that room. I was always in that room when a Caldwell birth happened. Randolph had called for me at every birth of consequence in the family for 15 years, and he would call for me for this one. And in that room at the critical moments that the labor would produce, I would be the person with the most knowledge and the most capability and the most consequential access, which was the specific situation that I had been in 147 times before, and that I had always resolved in the way the situation most clearly required. I was going to resolve this one differently, not by harming Louisa or the child. I want to say this with the absolute clarity it requires, because what I am describing is the most serious thing I have ever done, and the most serious thing this account contains, and it requires honesty that does not allow for ambiguity. I was not going to harm anyone. I was not going to use the knowledge and the access the birthing room gave me to produce an outcome that hurt the woman in the bed or the child she was delivering. What I was going to do was use the knowledge and the access to produce a specific outcome that served my purpose rather than the outcome that the Caldwell family's assumptions about the birth were expecting, by managing the labor in a way that was entirely medically appropriate and that produced through the specific decisions available to a skilled midwife in a difficult labor, a result that I needed rather than the result the Caldwell family had been assuming. The result I needed was leverage. The preparation I undertook in the 2 months between April and June of 1859 was the most careful preparation of my life, and I have spent 59 years preparing for things, which means the comparison has a large field to draw from. The first element of the preparation was medical. I needed to understand the specific dimensions of Louisa Caldwell's pregnancy and its likely complications with greater precision than my general monitoring of the household's health had already given me, which meant I needed additional access to Louisa in the weeks before the birth, access that I established through Mrs. Caldwell, Randolph's wife, who managed the household's medical arrangements and who had relied on my assessment of her daughters-in-law's pregnancies for 15 years, and who was entirely willing to increase the frequency of my visits to Louisa in the final weeks of the pregnancy. The medical preparation gave me what I needed, which was a comprehensive understanding of the specific way Louisa's labor was likely to progress, and the specific moments in that progression where decisions would be consequential, and where the consequences would be in the range of outcomes that I could influence through the choices I made. The second element of the preparation was the conversation I needed to have with someone who was not me. The leverage I was building required not just the event but the interpretation of the event, and the interpretation required a witness whose presence in the room and whose understanding of what they observed would give the event the meaning I needed it to have. I needed someone who would understand, without being told explicitly, what they were seeing in the birthing room, and whose understanding would be communicated to Randolph Caldwell in a form that produced the specific impression I needed Randolph to have. The person I chose was Mrs. Caldwell herself, not because I trusted her in any comprehensive sense, because she was the person in the Caldwell household whose understanding of the family's internal dynamics was most comprehensive, who had observed the inheritance question for longer than anyone else alive, who had her own assessment of Edmund and Charles and her own interest in the inheritance's resolution, and who was, in the specific context I was creating, the most reliable possible transmitter of the impression I needed Randolph to receive. I did not tell Mrs. Caldwell what I was doing. I told her what the medical situation was, which was accurate. The specific indicators that the labor was likely to be difficult, and the specific preparations I wanted in place for the birth. Preparations that were entirely medically appropriate, and that she accepted without question, because they were consistent with what she understood about difficult first labors, and consistent with the standards of preparation that I had always required for difficult births. The third element of the preparation was the conversation I had not yet had with Randolph Caldwell, and that I needed to have before the birth, a conversation whose specific content and timing I had been planning for weeks, that needed to happen at the specific moment when its impact on Randolph would be most significant and when his receptiveness to what I was going to say would be most complete. That moment arrived 3 days before Louisa went into labor. I asked to speak with Randolph, not an unusual request. I spoke with him regularly about the household's medical management. He received me in his study, and I sat across the desk from him in the chair I had been sitting in for 15 years, and I told him, in the composed professional voice I used for everything, that I had concerns about the coming birth. He listened. He always listened when I spoke about medical matters, because the results of my practice were the evidence that my assessments were accurate, and he was a man who trusted evidence. I told him the medical situation accurately, the specific indicators that the labor would be difficult, the specific preparations I had requested and that Mrs. Caldwell had arranged, the specific possibilities that a difficult first labor in a young woman with these indicators could produce, stated plainly and without dramatization, in the professional voice of a practitioner who is informing a family of the situation rather than frightening them about it. And then, in the same professional voice and in the same composed manner, and without any emphasis that would have distinguished what I was about to say from the medical information I had just provided, I told him one additional thing. I told him that in situations of this kind, where the labor was likely to be difficult and the decisions made in the critical moments were going to be consequential, the quality of the attention available in the birthing room was the most significant variable in the outcome. That the specific knowledge and experience the attending practitioner brought to those critical moments was what determined, in cases where nature alone was not decisive, which outcomes within the range of possible outcomes were produced. I told him that I had been attending difficult labors for 22 years and that I understood this variable as well as anyone practicing in Chatham County, and better than most. He looked at me with the specific quality of attention that he brought to important information, the attention of a systematic thinker who is processing what he has heard and its implications simultaneously. I held his gaze with the professional composure of 22 years. I said nothing further. I did not need to say anything further. What I had said was precisely enough to plant in Randolph Caldwell's systematic mind the specific understanding that I needed him to have before the birth, which was that the outcome of this birth was going to depend significantly on the quality and the commitment of the person in that room, and that the quality and the commitment of the person in that room was something that had conditions. I thanked him for his time, and I left. The labor began on a Tuesday evening in the second week of June. I was called to the Caldwell house at 8 o'clock, and I arrived at 8:30. And I found Louisa Caldwell in the early stages of a labor that was proceeding exactly as the indicators I had been monitoring for 2 months had suggested it would proceed, which was with the specific pattern of a difficult first labor in a young woman with narrow pelvic structure, a pattern I recognized immediately and completely. Mrs. Caldwell was in the room when I arrived, along with 2 house servants who had been designated to assist. The room had been prepared according to my specifications, which were the specifications I always required for a difficult birth, and the preparation had been done correctly, which was consistent with Mrs. Caldwell's management of everything she undertook. Edmund was not in the room. Men did not attend births in Savannah in 1859, except in the specific desperate circumstances that required their presence, which this labor had not yet produced. And Edmund was in the study with Randolph and Charles, which was where men of the Caldwell family waited during births, in the room where the decanter was and where the waiting was conducted, with the specific masculine performance of composure that concealed whatever was actually being felt. I began managing the labor with the full attention and the full capability that I brought to every labor, because the management of the labor was not something I was going to do partially or inattentively, regardless of the other purposes the room was serving. Louisa Caldwell was the woman in the bed, and she was in difficulty, and she deserved the full effort of the best practitioner available to her, and I was that practitioner, and I gave her that effort completely. The labor was long. It began in the evening and it continued through the night and into the following morning, which was not unusual for a first labor with these characteristics, but which was wearing in the specific way that long labors are wearing on everyone in the room, including the practitioner, and which produced in the room the specific quality of sustained attention under prolonged difficulty that reveals what everyone present is actually made of. What was revealed in that room over the course of 14 hours was not dramatic, and not what anyone watching from outside would have identified as significant. What Mrs. Caldwell saw in those 14 hours was a practitioner managing a difficult situation with complete professional competence and the specific quality of sustained attention that the situation required, doing what a skilled midwife does in a long, difficult first labor, which is making decision after decision in the specific moments that require decisions, and doing so with the quality of judgment that 22 years of practice produces. She also saw, because I ensured she could see it without it being pointed out to her, the specific quality of commitment with which I was managing the situation, the specific difference between a practitioner doing their job adequately and a practitioner who is fully present in the situation, who is bringing to the critical moments everything they have rather than the competent minimum the situation technically requires. I was bringing everything I had, not as a performance, because the woman in the bed required it, and because my standards required it, and because bringing anything less would have been a violation of everything my mother had taught me about the work, and everything 22 years of practice had confirmed about what the work was. But I was also in the small margins between the moments that required everything, making sure that Mrs. Caldwell's observation of the quality of my presence was as clear as it could be, that she was seeing what I was doing and understanding what it produced, and building across the 14 hours of the labor the specific understanding of the relationship between the practitioner's commitment and the outcome of the birth that I needed her to have. The child was born at 10 in the morning on the Wednesday, a son. Healthy, which was the outcome I had been working toward from the moment I arrived in the room, because Louisa's health and the child's health were not the leverage I was building. They were the foundation that the leverage required, the evidence that the commitment I had brought to the room had produced what it was supposed to produce. Louisa was exhausted and in pain, and the recovery was going to be slow, but she was alive, and the child was alive, and the birth had been managed with the quality that 22 years of practice produced when it was given fully to a situation that demanded it. I sat in the chair by the window when it was over, and I let the exhaustion of 14 hours settle into me, and I waited for Mrs. Caldwell to leave the room with the child, to take it to Randolph and Edmund and Charles, which was what happened after every Caldwell birth, the presentation of the heir to the men waiting in the study. She stopped at the door and she looked at me. The look was not the look of a woman managing a social performance. It was the look of a woman who had spent 14 hours in a room with another woman and who had seen, in those 14 hours, something she understood. She said, "We owe you a great debt, Pearl." I said I had done what the situation required. She left with the child. I sat in the chair and I waited for what I knew was going to come next, which was Randolph Caldwell. He came to the birthing room an hour after the birth. Not immediately, because immediately would have been unseemly, a man entering the birthing room before it had been restored to the condition in which a man could enter it without the unseemly acknowledgement of what the room had contained in its unreformed state. An hour, which was the appropriate interval, and he came alone, which told me that what he was coming to say was not something he was coming to say in front of other people. I was still in the chair by the window. I had not moved in the hour, which was not unusual after a 14-hour labor, and I had been using the hour the way I used every period of enforced stillness, which was to think with the specific comprehensive attention that the thinking required. He sat in the chair across from me, the chair that Mrs. Caldwell had been using during the labor, the chair of the person who was present in the room but not the person managing it, and he looked at me with the specific quality of attention that I had been receiving from him for 15 years, the attention of a systematic thinker in the presence of someone whose capabilities he had been forced over 15 years to revise his assumptions about. He said, "My wife tells me the situation was more difficult than she had anticipated." I said that first labors with the characteristics this one had were often more difficult than the families expected. He said, "She tells me you managed it with a quality of attention she has not seen before." I said I had done what the situation required. He was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet around us, the specific quiet of a space that has held something enormous and that has not yet returned to its ordinary function. He said, "I want to speak with you about Seraphine." I said I was listening. He said, "I understand that the arrangement I described in April has caused you concern." I said that I had given it considerable thought. He said, "I want you to understand that Edmund's intentions towards Seraphine are entirely appropriate, that she would be well cared for and well treated in his household." I said I appreciated him telling me that. Then I said something else. I said it in the same composed professional voice I had been using for the entire conversation, the voice I had been using for 15 years in this room and every room in his household, and I said it without emphasis and without anything that could be characterized as a threat, because what I was saying did not require emphasis and was not a threat, but simply information. I said that I had been present at every significant birth in the Caldwell family for 15 years, that I had been present at the births of Edmund and Charles and the births of their children, and that I expected to be present at the births that were coming in the years ahead, including whatever births the child born this morning might eventually produce. I said that the quality of my presence in those births was the specific quality that Mrs. Caldwell had observed in the past 14 hours, and that the quality of that presence was the most significant variable in the outcomes of difficult births, which the Caldwell family had reason to know, because the Caldwell family had a history of difficult births that I had been managing for 15 years. I said that the quality of my presence in those rooms was something I brought to every situation I was called to, without condition, as a matter of professional commitment and personal standard. And then I said that I was a woman with a daughter whom I loved, and that the well-being of my daughter was the most significant concern of my personal life, and that I found it difficult to maintain the quality of presence that difficult births required in situations where the most significant concern of my personal life was itself a significant concern. I said this plainly and without elaboration, and then I stopped speaking. Randolph Caldwell sat across from me in the chair by the window of the birthing room, and he looked at me with the systematic intelligence that had built the largest plantation operation in Chatham County, and that was now being applied to what I had just said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I understood he was not constructing an immediate response but processing what I had said with the full weight of his intelligence, which was what I had been counting on, because a man of Randolph Caldwell's intelligence, given what I had just said and given what he had just witnessed in the past 14 hours, and given what his wife had told him, and given what he understood about the relationship between the person in the birthing room and the outcomes of births in a family with the Caldwell family's history, would arrive at the understanding I needed him to arrive at without my needing to say anything more explicit than what I had said. He arrived at it. I could see the arrival in the specific quality of change in his expression, the change that happens in a systematic thinker's face when a calculation resolves. He said, "I will speak with Edmund." I said, "Thank you, sir." He stood, and he left the room, and I sat in the chair by the window, and I breathed for the first time in what felt like several minutes. Randolph Caldwell's conversation with Edmund produced over the following 3 weeks a series of developments that I observed from the specific vantage point of my continued presence in the Caldwell household's medical management, and that I want to describe accurately because the accuracy matters. The first development was that the arrangement involving Seraphine was not implemented. I learned this not from any direct communication, from either Randolph or Edmund, but from Seraphine herself, who was informed by the housekeeper that her assignment had been changed and that she would be working in the kitchen rather than in Edmund's household, a change that was communicated to her with no explanation and that required no explanation because the change was the explanation. Seraphine came to me that evening with the specific quality of a person who has received news they were not expecting and who is not yet sure what the receiving of it means. I told her what she needed to know, which was that the arrangement had changed and that she would not be going to Edmund's household, and I told her nothing else, because nothing else was mine to tell, and because the nothing else was not something she needed in order to understand that what had changed in a direction that protected her. She looked at me for a long moment with the eyes that were my mother's eyes in her face, and she said, "What did you do?" I said I had done what the situation required. She continued to look at me, and then she nodded, the nod of a person who has received an answer that is not the full answer, but that is the answer the person giving it has decided to give, and she accepted it with the specific dignity of someone who understands that some things are not hers to know, and who does not diminish the thing by pressing for more than is being offered. The second development was more significant and more extended, and concerned not Seraphine specifically, but the inheritance question that had been present in the Caldwell family's calculations for a decade, and that Randolph's conversation with Edmund had apparently accelerated in ways that I observed over the following months, in the specific conversations that happened in rooms where I was present. I do not know exactly what was said between Randolph and Edmund in the conversation that my words in the birthing room had produced. I know what I observed in the weeks and months that followed, which was a change in the quality of Randolph's engagement with the inheritance question, a movement from the indirect management of the question that had characterized the previous years to a more direct confrontation with it, a confrontation that produced, in the months between June and December of 1859, a series of discussions between Randolph and his lawyers and between Randolph and Charles that were the specific discussions of a man revising the arrangements he has made in ways that reflect a revised assessment of the people those arrangements concern. I was not the cause of this revision in any simple sense. The revision had been building for years in Randolph's own assessment of his sons, and what had happened in the birthing room and in the conversation, after it had not changed that assessment, but had created the specific conditions under which Randolph was willing to act on it more directly than he had been willing to act before. What I had done was make the inheritance question concrete in a way that Randolph's systematic intelligence could act on. I had provided, through the conversation in the birthing room, a specific and immediate demonstration of the relationship between the quality of the person in the critical role and the outcome of the critical situation, a demonstration that Randolph's systematic thinking could generalize from the birthing room to the plantation's management, from the midwife's commitment to the heir's capability, from the outcome of a difficult birth to the outcome of a difficult inheritance. The generalization, once it was available to a mind like Randolph's, was not a long step. I continued to practice in Chatham County after June of 1859. The war came, and the war ended, and the arrangements that had governed my practice changed in the ways that all arrangements changed, and I practiced in the new arrangements with the same quality I had brought to the practice in the old ones, because the quality of the work was not conditional on the arrangements, and never had been. Seraphine is 41 years old now. She married a man named Abraham who came to Savannah after the war from the Georgia interior with the specific quality of a person who had survived something and who had come out of the surviving not diminished but clarified, and she has been married to him for 16 years, and they have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of them free in the sense that the amendment has produced, all of them growing up in a world that is different from the world their mother grew up in the ways the differences are real, and in the same world in the ways the sameness is also real. She knows what I did in the spring of 1859. I told her when she was old enough to receive the full account, which was several years after the events, when the world had changed enough that the telling was no longer the kind of risk that the events themselves had been. She received the full account with the specific quality of attention she had always brought to things that mattered, completely, and without the simplifying response that difficult information sometimes produces in people who are not ready for its complexity. She said, "You used their trust against them." I said, "I used the trust they gave me for the purpose that trust was given for. I kept Louisa and the child safe. I did what the situation required in the birthing room. And I told Randolph Caldwell the truth about the relationship between the quality of the practitioner's commitment and the outcome of difficult births, which was not a threat and was not a manipulation. It was the truth, said at the specific moment when Randolph was most positioned to understand its full implications. She said, "But you chose the moment." I said, "Yes, I chose the moment." She was quiet for a while, and then she said that she thought she understood, and I believe she did understand, not in the simple sense, but in the complicated sense, which is the only sense in which what I did can be understood accurately. I have been in the birthing room 193 times across 40 years of practice. The number includes the 147 that preceded June of 1859, and the 46 that have come in the years since, in the changed world that the war produced, in which I practice among the same families I have always practiced among and among new families, and in the community that is building itself in the aftermath of the war, with the specific energy of people who have been held back and who are no longer held back, and who have more to build than the time available for building usually permits. The birthing room has taught me everything I know about what people actually are, which is distinct from everything I know about what people present themselves as, and the distinction is the most important thing that 40 years of this work has produced in me. What people actually are in the room where a child is born is this. They are people who love the person in the bed, or who need the person in the bed, or who own the person in the bed, and the form their response to the situation takes reveals which of these is actually true, regardless of which of these they have been performing. I have seen men who performed ownership behave like love in the critical moments, and I have seen men who performed love behave like ownership, and the performance is the one thing the birthing room strips away, and what is underneath is what has always been there. I have also learned across 40 years and 193 births what the work actually is. Not what I was told it was when my mother taught it to me, which was the management of birth and its complications in service of the health of the mother and the child. That description is accurate, and it is also insufficient. The work is what any work that requires complete knowledge and complete skill and complete presence in moments of extremity is, which is an exercise in the full use of everything a person is, applied to the situation the work presents, without reservation and without the holding back that the protection of the self sometimes requires in other contexts. In the birthing room there is no holding back. There cannot be. The situation requires everything, and the practitioner who holds back anything produces outcomes that the full giving would not produce. I have known this for 40 years, and I have practiced it for 40 years, and I practiced it in June of 1859 in the room where Louisa Caldwell labored for 14 hours, and where I gave everything I had to a situation that also, for the first time in my practice, gave me something in return. What it gave me was Seraphine's safety. Not absolute safety, because there is no absolute safety available in the world Seraphine was born into, but the specific safety of the immediate situation, the removal of the specific threat that the spring of 1859 had presented, the protection of a 19-year-old girl from a fate that I had watched consume 3 other women, and that I was not willing to watch consume my daughter. That is what I did with 22 years of knowledge and access and the trust of the families I served. I used it once, precisely, and without more than the situation required, and without causing any harm to the woman in the bed or the child she delivered or anyone else in the room. I used the truth of the birthing room, which is the truth that the practitioner's commitment and the outcome of difficult births are not independent of each other, to create the specific conditions in which Randolph Caldwell's systematic intelligence could arrive at the understanding I needed him to arrive at. And then I went back to practicing the way I had always practiced, with complete commitment and complete skill and complete honesty, because the work requires those things, and the woman in the bed deserves them, and I am not capable of giving anything less than everything the situation requires. I am 61 years old. I have been in the birthing room 193 times. I have delivered 193 children into the world, each of them a complete and specific person whose beginning I was present for and whose beginning produced in me every time. The specific sensation that the beginning of a person produces in someone who understands what the beginning is and what it costs and what it is worth. 193 beginnings. I have been present for all of them with everything I had to bring. I want to say something about the choice I made in June of 1859, because I have been asked about it in various ways in the years since, and because the asking always contains within it a question that the asking does not always state directly, which is whether what I did was right. I will answer it directly. What I did was right. Not in the simple sense that it produced the outcome I needed, though it did. In the sense that the full examination of it, the examination I have been conducting for the past 12 years in the specific internal accounting that decisions of that weight demand, produces the conclusion that the doing of it was right, given the situation I was in and the resources I had and the thing I was protecting and the means I used to protect it. I did not harm anyone. I managed a difficult birth with complete commitment and complete skill, and I produced the best possible outcome for the woman in the bed and the child she delivered. I told a powerful man the truth about the relationship between the quality of the practitioner's commitment and the outcome of difficult births. I said nothing that was false. I threatened nothing. I demanded nothing. I simply told the truth at the specific moment when the truth had the most force, when the man I was telling it to was most positioned to understand its full implications, and I allowed his own intelligence to do the work that his own intelligence was entirely capable of doing. That is what I did. That is all I did. And the outcome was my daughter's safety and the continuation of my practice and the 146 births that have happened since, each one managed with the same commitment and the same skill and the same full presence that the work has always required from me and that I have always given it. Seraphine is safe. Her children are free. And I am still in the birthing room, still bringing everything I have to every situation that requires it, still arriving when I am called and staying until the work is done, and leaving when the room has returned to what it was before I arrived, and the new person in the world is in the arms of the person whose arms they belong in. This is the work. This has always been the work. And the spring of 1859 was the one time in 40 years that the work gave me back something that was not the work itself, something that was mine rather than the room's, something that the room was the instrument of rather than the purpose of. I am still in the room. I am still bringing everything. And my daughter is alive, and her children are free, and the work continues. That is everything I have to tell. That is the whole of it.
This is the story of Pearl, born enslaved in Savannah, Georgia in 1802, who practiced as a midwife in Chatham County for 40 years, from approximately 1837 until at least 1880. Chatham County records document the Caldwell family and other prominent planter families of the region through the antebellum period. The practice of enslaved midwives serving both enslaved and white communities in the antebellum South, and the specific knowledge and access such practice provided, is extensively documented in the historical scholarship on medicine and slavery in the American South. The specific use of that access as an instrument of resistance, while rarely documented in the form of first-person accounts, is consistent with the historical record of the forms that resistance took among enslaved people with specialized knowledge and access in plantation households. Pearl Freeman appears in Savannah City records from 1865 onward as a practicing midwife in the city's free black and broader community. Her account, written in the early 1870s, was preserved by the Savannah Free Black community and donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1929, where it has been studied by historians of medicine, slavery, and resistance as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the use of specialized professional knowledge as an instrument of protection and resistance in the antebellum South. If Pearl's story moved you, if you believe that the most complete form of knowledge is knowledge that has been accumulated in the service of others, and that can, when the situation demands it, be turned to the service of oneself without violating the standards that produced it. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Pearl's story. The 22 years of presence in the birthing room. The conversation with Randolph Caldwell. The truth she told that was nothing but the truth. Seraphine at 41 with her 4 free children. The 193 beginnings. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.